The fluorescent lights of the Seattle General Trauma Bay hummed with a clinical, unforgiving vibration, casting a harsh glare over the sterile linoleum. For Nia Carter, the sound was a constant companion, a background noise she used to anchor herself while the world around her descended into its usual midday frenzy. She moved with a measured, deliberate grace, her hands steady as she organized a suture tray, her natural curls pulled back into a tight, professional bun that some of her colleagues had spitefully whispered looked unkempt for a surgical environment. "Carter, I asked for the CBC results 3 minutes ago. Are you daydreaming again?" The voice belonged to Dr. Harrison, a man whose ego was as inflated as his surgical reputation. He stood over a patient with a minor abdominal laceration, his brow furrowed in performative stress. Beside him, 3 other attending physicians, men who had spent more time in country clubs than in trenches, smirked. Nia didn't flinch. She didn't even look up from the tray. "The lab is backed up with the multi-car pileup in Bay 4, Doctor. I've already called down twice. The results will be on the monitor in 60 seconds. 60 seconds, Dr. Miller. A silver-haired surgeon with a penchant for condescension mimicked her. "You see, that's the problem, Nia. You're always so calm. It comes off as clueless. In a trauma center, we need urgency. We need people who can keep up with the pace of real medicine, not someone who moves like they're strolling through a park." Nia finally looked up, her dark eyes meeting Miller's with an intensity that briefly made him blink. She saw what they saw, a young black woman they had categorized as the diversity hire, a nurse they assumed was overwhelmed by the complexity of a level 1 trauma center because she didn't sweat when a patient bled. They saw a quiet girl they could push around, unaware that her slow pace was actually the calculated efficiency of someone who had stabilized femoral arteries in the back of a moving vehicle while taking fire. "I prioritize accuracy over optics, Dr. Miller," she said, her voice a low, smooth contrast to his frantic pitch. "Accuracy? You can barely keep up with the intake charts," Harrison snapped, stepping away from the bed to loom over her. He gestured vaguely at her hair, his lip curling. "Maybe if you spent less time on your style and more time on the protocols, you wouldn't be the weakest link in this department. You're lucky we're short-staffed. Or the board would have replaced you months ago with someone who actually understands the stakes of this job." The other doctors chuckled, a dry, elitist sound that echoed off the cold metal cabinets. They called her Clueless Carter when they thought she wasn't listening. They made jokes about how she was too relaxed for the ER, mistaking her combat-hardened stoicism for a lack of intellect. To them, she was just a body in scrubs, a subordinate who didn't know her place. Nia felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, the urge to tell them exactly where she had earned her stripes. She wanted to tell them that while they were studying for midterms, she was jumping out of helicopters into the dark heart of mountain ranges they couldn't find on a map. But she pushed it down. She had come to Seattle for the quiet. She had chosen this invisibility because the alternative, the noise, the blood, the screams of Viper One, over a radio, was a ghost she wasn't ready to face. "The results are up, Doctor," Nia said, pointing to the screen as it flickered to life. Harrison didn't thank her. He didn't even acknowledge she was right. He simply grunted, snatched a pair of forceps from her tray, and turned his back to her. "Just stay out of the way, Carter. Try not to get lost on your way to the supply closet. We have actual lives to save." Nia stepped back, her face a mask of iron composure. She didn't know that in less than 10 minutes, the ground beneath Harrison's expensive loafers would begin to shake. She didn't know that the sky was about to tear open, and the actual lives that needed saving were the only people in the world who knew exactly who she was. For now, she was just the clueless nurse, standing in the shadows of men who had no idea they were in the presence of a legend. The heavy silence that followed Dr. Harrison's dismissal didn't last long. It was punctured first by a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the soles of Nia's sensible nursing shoes. At first, the staff thought it was a generator failure or a heavy freight truck, but the vibration rapidly escalated into a bone-shaking roar. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass of the ER entrance, the sky darkened as if a localized storm had moved in. A matte black MH-60M Black Hawk, devoid of standard markings, dropped out of the low clouds, its rotor wash sending patio furniture and hospital signage tumbling across the parking lot like autumn leaves. The surgeons froze. Dr. Miller dropped a chart, and Dr. Harrison stared mouth agape as the automatic sliding doors struggled to open against the sheer force of the wind. Before the rotors had even begun to cycle down, the doors were forced wide by gloved hands. A squad of Tier 1 operators in multicam fatigues, armed with suppressed carbines and wearing high-cut ballistic helmets, breached the perimeter. They didn't move like police. They moved like a precision machine, securing the corners of the trauma bay with cold, lethal efficiency. The hospital security guards, usually so quick to bark at Nia for her slow pace, stood paralyzed against the walls. Through the center of the formation strode Captain Marcus Steele. He was a mountain of a man, his face smeared with tactical paint and sweat, his eyes scanning the room with a predatory focus that made the senior surgeons shrink back. "Who is in charge here?" Dr. Harrison stammered, stepping forward with a shaky sense of entitlement. "This is a sterile medical environment. You can't just—" Steele didn't even look at him. He swiveled his head, ignoring the white coats and the stethoscopes, until his gaze locked onto the young woman standing quietly by the suture tray. "Captain, I must insist you leave," Dr. Miller added, his voice cracking. "We are in the middle of a trauma intake. That nurse you're looking at is a subordinate. She's barely keeping up as it is. If you need medical assistance, you talk to me." Captain Steele finally spoke, his voice a gravelly baritone that cut through the fading whine of the helicopter engines. "I'm not looking for a civilian surgeon who thinks a trauma is a golf cart accident. I'm looking for the best combat medic the 160th ever produced." He ignored Miller's outstretched hand and marched straight toward Nia. The soldiers in the room snapped to a subtle but rigid attention as he approached her. The doctors watched, breathless and confused, waiting for Nia to shrink away or apologize for the intrusion. Instead, Nia Carter straightened her shoulders. The clueless haze the doctors thought they saw in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard clarity. She didn't look like a girl struggling with protocols anymore. She looked like a commander. Steele stopped exactly 2 feet in front of her. In a motion that sent a shockwave through the room, the battle-hardened captain snapped a crisp, razor-sharp salute. "Viper 1, Steele said, his voice echoing off the sterile tiles. "The nest is empty, and the clock is at 0. We have 3 men down in a high-threat ravine. We've got an arterial bleed that 2 of my best medics can't plug, and the weather is closing the window. You're the only one with the rating to jump this mission." Nia didn't hesitate. She didn't glance at Harrison for permission or check the duty roster. She looked Steele in the eye and nodded once. "Status of the bird?" "Hot and waiting, ma'am," Steele replied. Nia reached up, pulled the hair tie from her head, and let her curls free for a split second before tightening them into a combat-ready knot. She turned to the stunned medical board, her gaze lingering on Dr. Miller. "I'm taking my break," she said quietly. As she strode toward the doors, flanked by the tactical team, Harrison finally found his voice. "Carter, if you walk out that door, you're fired. You're just a nurse. You're nothing without this hospital." Nia didn't stop. She didn't even look back. Captain Steele, however, paused at the threshold. He looked at Harrison with a look of pure, unadulterated pity. "She isn't just a nurse, doctor. She's the reason people like me get to come home. Try not to trip over your ego while she's out doing your job." With a final gust of wind and the scream of the turbines, the clueless nurse vanished into the belly of the Black Hawk, leaving the experts standing in a cloud of dust and silence. The roar of the Black Hawk outside was no longer a distant threat. It was a hungry beast waiting for its master. Inside the trauma bay, the air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel and the stunned silence of the medical staff. Nia didn't wait for a formal exit. She moved toward the locker room with a purpose that made the heavy tactical boots of the soldiers behind her sound like a percussion section to her lead. "Dr." Harrison scrambled after her, his face a frantic mask of indignation. "Carter, you can't just walk out. There are protocols. You have patience." Nia stopped at her locker, her hand steady as she punched in the code. She didn't look at him. "The patient in Bay 2 has a simple laceration you were already treating. The patient in Bay 4 is waiting for a lab result I've already secured. My patients are currently bleeding out in a ravine 3,000 feet up. Priorities. Doctor." She swung the locker door open. Tucked behind her civilian jacket and a spare pair of nursing clogs was a vacuum-sealed olive drab bag. With a fluid motion, she ripped it open. The surgeons and nurses who had crowded into the hallway gasped as she began to shed the light blue scrubs they had used to define her. Underneath, she wasn't the clueless girl they had mocked. She was a woman of lean, functional muscle. her skin mapped with the faint white lines of old scars they had never bothered to notice. She pulled on the flame-resistant flight suit, the fabric zipping up with a sharp, final metallic click. From the top shelf of the locker, she retrieved a patch. It was a coiled desert viper embroidered in black and gold. She pressed the Velcro backing onto her shoulder with a firm slap. Dr. Miller stood at the edge of the crowd, his mouth hanging open as he saw the silver oak leaves pinned to her collar, the insignia of a lieutenant colonel. "You're your active duty?" "I was Fleet Reserve," Nia said, her voice now carrying the resonance of a commanding officer. "But as of 60 seconds ago, Captain Steele has invoked a Title 10 medical emergency. I've been reactivated." She reached back into the locker and pulled out her hospital ID badge. It was the same one Harrison had sneered at, the one that identified her as staff nurse. She looked at the photo, a version of herself that looked tired, small, and muted. Without a word, she unclipped it and let it fall. It hit the linoleum floor with a plastic clatter that seemed to echo louder than the helicopter rotors. "Keep it," Nia said, looking Harrison directly in the eye. It never really fit anyway. Steele handed her a tactical medical vest, heavy with trauma shears, quick-clot gauze, and specialized surgical tools. As she slid her arms through the vest and buckled the chest plate, the transformation was complete. The slow nurse was gone. Standing in her place was Viper 1, a legend of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. "Gear check," Steele barked. "Vitals monitor active, surgical kit sealed, comms on frequency green," Nia replied, her tone clipped and professional. The ER staff parted like the Red Sea as she strode back toward the entrance. Nurses she had worked alongside for 2 years looked at her, as if she were a stranger from another planet. The arrogance that had fueled the department all morning had evaporated, replaced by a haunting realization. They had spent months belittling a woman who operated in a world they weren't even qualified to dream about. At the sliding doors, Nia paused. The wind from the rotors whipped her curls, and the red emergency lights of the hospital painted her in the colors of war. She looked back at the board of doctors one last time. "By the way, Dr. Harrison," she called out over the scream of the engines. "The patient in Bay 2. You missed the signs of a tension pneumothorax because you were too busy looking at my hair. You might want to check his breath sounds before his lung collapses. I'd do it myself, but I have a real war to get to." She turned and ran toward the hovering Black Hawk, her hand reaching up to grab the hoist as Steele's team hauled her into the darkness of the cabin. The doors slammed shut, and with a deafening surge of power, the helicopter pitched forward and vanished into the clouds, leaving Seattle General behind in a swirl of dust and shattered egos. The cabin of the Black Hawk was a world of vibrating steel and tactical green light. As the helicopter pitched forward, the skyscrapers of Seattle shrank into miniature models of glass and light, quickly swallowed by the roiling, charcoal-colored clouds of a Pacific Northwest storm. Inside, the roar of the twin engines was a physical weight, but for Nia, it was the sound of her own pulse returning to a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. She sat strapped into the jump seat, her tactical medical vest cinched tight, across from Captain Steele. He handed her a ruggedized tablet, the screen glowing with a topographic map of a jagged mountain pass known as the Devil's Throat. 20 minutes out, Steele's voice crackled through her headset, clear and sharp despite the acoustic chaos. "The mission is a high-altitude extraction under duress. My team was tracking a high-value data courier when they were ambushed by a private security firm, Mercenaries Viper. They took out the Osprey's tail rotor. The bird is down on a 45-degree incline, wedged in a ravine that's a literal wind tunnel." Nia swiped through the data, her eyes scanning thermal signatures and casualty reports. She didn't look like the woman who had been bullied over a chart 10 minutes ago. Her gaze was clinical, piercing, and devoid of doubt. "Casualty count?" she asked, her voice steady as the bird hit a pocket of turbulence that would have made Dr. Harrison lose his lunch. 7 survivors. 2 walking wounded for stable, and 1 critical, Steele replied, his face darkening. "The critical is Sergeant Elias Thorne. He took a shrapnel spray to the chest when the hull breached. We've got a suspected aortic tear and a massive hemothorax. My medic on the ground has him on a portable ventilator, but he's fading fast. He's already gone into cardiac arrest once. They brought him back, but they can't keep him stable in the field." Nia looked at the thermal feed of the crash site. The Osprey was a twisted skeleton of metal resting on a precipice. The weather was worsening. The dead zone was earning its name as visibility dropped to near zero. "You're asking for a field thoracotomy," Nia said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "Inside a downed airframe, in sub-zero temperatures, while under fire." "I'm asking because you're the only one who has ever pulled it off," Steele said, his eyes locking onto hers with a desperate, unwavering respect. "Everyone else said Thorne is a black tag. Expectant. They said he's already dead. I told them they haven't seen Viper 1 work." Nia looked down at her hands. They were the same hands that had been mocked for being slow earlier that morning. She felt the weight of the surgical kit in her vest, the clamps, the scalpels, the sutures. In the hospital, those tools were used in sterile, quiet rooms with a dozen assistants. Here, her only assistant would be the adrenaline in her veins and the steel in her soul. "If the aorta is torn, I have a 3-minute window once I open him up," Nia briefed, her mind already visualizing the anatomy of the chest, the slickness of the blood, and the precision required to clamp a vessel the size of a garden hose in the dark. "I'll need your team to provide a human shield. I can't have the bird shaking from RPG impacts while I'm holding his heart in my hands." "You'll have your shield," Steele promised, reaching over to check the seal on her oxygen mask. "But the wind is too high for a landing. We're going to have to hoist you down." 50-foot drop into a hot zone. Nia reached up and pulled the visor of her helmet down, the world turning a sharp, high-contrast amber. She didn't think about the hospital. She didn't think about the doctors who thought she was clueless. She thought about Sergeant Thorne, a man she had never met, whose life was currently a flickering candle in a hurricane. "Prepare the hoist," Nia commanded, her voice the only calm thing in the sky. "Viper 1 is going in." The transition from the vibrating belly of the Black Hawk to the frozen chaos of the ravine was a violent blur of gravity and wind. Nia descended the hoist line like a shadow, hitting the uneven, snow-dusted rock with a precision that belied her years in the civilian world. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, burnt hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. Around her, the ravine was a theater of war. Tracers from mercenary positions on the ridgeline streaked across the sky like angry red needles, intercepted by the rhythmic thumping of Steele's team returning fire. "Viper 1 is on deck." A voice screamed over the comms. Nia didn't wait for an escort. She stayed low, her boots skidding on the 45-degree incline as she scrambled toward the mangled remains of the Osprey. Inside the darkened hull, the scene was a nightmare of twisted alloy. Sergeant Elias Thorne lay sprawled on a pile of gear, his face the color of wood ash. A young medic was kneeling over him, his hands slick and shaking as he held a saturated dressing against Thorne's shattered chest. "Move," Nia commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an override. The medic scrambled back, recognizing the authority in her voice even before he saw the Viper patch on her shoulder. Nia dropped to her knees in the dirt, the grit of the mountain floor grinding into the fabric of her flight suit. She didn't have the luxury of a sterile field, an anesthesia team, or the high-tech monitors of Seattle General. She had a flickering tactical light, a freezing wind howling through the fuselage, and the fading pulse of a soldier who was seconds away from slipping into the dark. She ripped open her trauma kit. "Thorne, stay with me," she muttered, her fingers dancing over his neck to find the carotid. It was a thready, weak, and rapid. His chest was silent on the left side, the skin stretched tight and bruised a deep, sickly purple. "He's got a massive hemothorax and a suspected aortic breach," Nia called out to the medic. "I'm opening him up. Now." She didn't hesitate. With a steady hand that would have left Dr. Harrison speechless, Nia sliced through the skin and muscle of the fifth intercostal space. Blood, dark and pressurized, sprayed out, coating her visor and the sleeves of her suit. She ignored it. She used a rib spreader to force the cavity open. The sound of cracking cartilage lost in the roar of a nearby grenade blast that rocked the Osprey. "Shield!" Steele roared from the entrance, his body silhouetted by muzzle flashes as he and another operator stood in the breach, their armor taking the brunt of the ricochets to give her a pocket of stillness. Nia reached into the cavity, her bare hand plunging into the warmth of Thorne's chest. The heat of his life force was a jarring contrast to the freezing mountain air. She felt the lung collapsed and pushed it aside, her fingers searching for the source of the torrential bleed. There, just below the arch, a jagged tear in the aorta. "Pulsing weakly, I have the breach," she whispered, her focus narrowing until the war outside ceased to exist. She took a vascular clamp from her vest. her movements slow and deliberate despite the chaos. With a click that felt like a heartbeat, she cinched the vessel. The torrential flow slowed to a trickle. She then reached further, her fingers finding the heart itself. It had stopped. "Not today, Sergeant," she hissed. She began manual cardiac massage, rhythmically squeezing the muscle with her hand, her eyes fixed on the portable monitor the medic had hooked up. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. For a long, agonizing minute. The only sound was the clatter of gunfire and the wet rhythm of Nia's hand inside Thorne's chest. Then a beep. A jagged green line spiked on the monitor. Then another. "He's back," the medic gasped, his voice cracking. "Viper, you got him back." Nia didn't celebrate. She kept her hand on the clamp, her body shielding Thorne from the dust shaken loose by another explosion. "He's stable for transport, but we have to move now. This clamp won't hold if we take another hit." She looked up, her face smeared with blood and grease, her eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. The clueless nurse was gone. The Viper had reclaimed her territory. The stabilization of Sergeant Thorne had bought them minutes. But the mountain was determined to take them back. As Nia secured the final suture, a rhythmic thwack ping echoed through the Osprey's hull, the sound of high-caliber rounds punching through the carbon fiber skin. Outside, the ridgeline erupted in a fresh volley of muzzle flashes. The mercenaries were closing the distance, sensing that the Viper was about to slip through their fingers. "Viper, we're being flanked." Steele's voice was strained, his rifle barking in short, controlled bursts from the ramp. "They're pushing the east slope. We can't move Thorne until we suppress that fire, but my guys are pinned." A sudden explosion rocked the fuselage, sending a shower of glass and sparks over Nia's surgical field. The medic who had been assisting her was thrown backward, clutching a shoulder peppered with shrapnel. Thorne groaned, his blood pressure spiking as the shockwave rattled his fragile repair. Nia didn't panic. She didn't look for a place to hide. She reached into the webbing of her tactical vest. But she didn't pull out a scalpel this time. She grabbed a discarded M4 carbine from the gear pile, her movements fluid and practiced. To the doctors at Seattle General. Nia was the woman who struggled to carry a heavy tray of charts. Here, she shouldered the weapon with a grim, familiar ease, her eye finding the combat optic in a fraction of a second. "Steele, eyes on the eastern cluster," she shouted, her voice cutting through the cacophony of the storm. "I've got the flank. Cover the medic." She crawled to a jagged hole in the Osprey's side, the sub-zero wind whipping her curls. Two mercenaries in gray winter camo were sliding down the ravine, intent on tossing a thermobaric grenade into the wreckage. Nia didn't hesitate. She took a breath, held it at the bottom of the exhale, and squeezed the trigger. 2 shots, rhythmic and precise. The first mercenary fell instantly. The second scrambled for cover. But Nia's third shot found its mark before he could prime his charge. "Target neutralized," she called out, her tone as cold and clinical as if she were reading a temperature. But the pressure didn't let up. A third shadow emerged from behind a rock, raising an RPG launcher. Steele was occupied with the main force, his back turned. Nia knew that if that rocket hit the Osprey, the oxygen tanks inside would turn the wreck into a funeral pyre. She dropped the carbine, realizing she didn't have the angle. Instead, she grabbed a flare gun from the emergency rack, loaded a high-intensity magnesium round, and aimed for the leaking hydraulic fluid near the mercenary's feet. The flare hit the pool of oil, and the ravine erupted in a blinding white-orange blossom of flame. Toby Maguire, February 15th, 2026, 2:59 p.m. The mercenary was engulfed, his aim faltering as the rocket soared harmlessly into the sky, exploding against the far cliffside. Nia didn't stop to watch the fire. She immediately dropped back to Thorne's side, her hands moving from the weapon back to the patient without a single tremor. She checked the vascular clamp. It was still holding. She checked his pupils. They were reactive. "Medic, get the litter ready," she commanded, her voice a whip crack that snapped the wounded man back to attention. "The fire bought us a hole in their line. We move on the next reload cycle." Steele looked back over his shoulder, seeing the carnage Nia had just wrought on their flank. For a second, he saw the clueless nurse the doctors had described. But then he saw the blood on her flight suit, the smoking flare gun, and the steady, unbreakable gaze of a woman who had mastered both life and death. "You heard the colonel." Steele roared to his men, his respect for her now bordering on awe. "Viper's got the door. Move the casualty. Now, now, now." Nia grabbed one end of the litter, her slow pace replaced by an explosive, functional strength. They moved out into the freezing night, Nia shielding Thorne's open chest with her own body as they ran toward the hovering shadow of the Black Hawk, proving once and for all that she was the most dangerous person in the ravine. The transition from the solid, frozen rock of the ravine to the vertical void of the sky was a violent test of will. As the Black Hawk hovered precariously between the jagged canyon walls, the hoist cable unspooled like a thin silver lifeline in a storm of snow and steel. Steel's team had formed a tight perimeter around the litter, their muzzle flashes the only light in the suffocating darkness of the Devil's Throat. "Viper, you're up. Hook in," Steel yelled over the deafening whine of the rotors. Nia didn't hesitate. She clipped her carabiner to the litter's harness and then to her own chest plate, anchoring herself to Sergeant Thorne. As the winch began to take the slack, a sudden, piercing whistle cut through the air. RPG. 11 o'clock. The world turned a blinding, searing white as a rocket slammed into the cliffside 50 feet above them. The explosion rained down a curtain of shale and fire. The Black Hawk jerked violently, the pilot fighting the erratic thermals created by the blast. Nia and Thorne were ripped from the ground, swinging like a pendulum over the 1,000-foot drop. Nia's stomach lurched as they spun in the rotor wash. Below them, the ravine looked like a boiling cauldron of shadows and tracers. She could feel the vibration of the cable, a high-pitched hum that signaled the winch was straining against the gale-force winds. Thorne groaned, his head lolling to the side. The sudden change in altitude and the violent swaying were putting immense pressure on his compromised chest cavity. "Easy, Thorne. Look at me," Nia commanded, her voice a calm anchor in his fading consciousness. She reached out, her gloved hand steadying his oxygen mask as they spun. Another rocket streaked through the air, passing so close to the helicopter that the heat of its exhaust scorched the air around them. The pilot banked hard to the left to avoid the impact, causing the hoist cable to scrape against the fuselage with a terrifying metallic shriek. Nia was slammed against the side of the litter, her shoulder taking the brunt of the impact, but she didn't let go of the vascular clamp. She was still manually stabilizing through the opening in Thorne's flight suit. "We're losing the winch motor," the crew chief screamed from the cabin above, his shadow silhouetted against the dim red interior light. "I'm going to have to haul you in manually for the last 10 feet. Nia looked up. The open door of the Black Hawk seemed miles away, a small rectangle of safety in an ocean of chaos. She could see the crew chief and another operator reaching out, their hands straining to grab the litter. Below, the mercenaries had reached the crash site, their fire now directed upward at the vulnerable underbelly of the bird. "Pull," Nia roared, her voice lost to everyone but the ghosts of the mountain. With a final, bone-jarring heave, the crew chief grabbed the handle of the litter. Nia used her free hand to catch the edge of the floor, her muscles screaming as she hauled herself and her patient into the vibrating cabin. The moment they cleared the threshold, the door slammed shut with a definitive thud, cutting off the sound of the wind. The silence inside the cabin, save for the roar of the engines, was heavy. Nia stayed on the floor, her knees tucked under her hands still inside Thorne's chest. She was covered in a mixture of frost, hydraulic fluid, and the sergeant's blood, but her eyes were clear. "Level out," she ordered the pilot. "I need to check the seal. We're not losing him now." Steele scrambled into the cabin behind them, his face caked in soot. He looked at Nia, then at the flickering monitor showing Thorne's steady, stubborn heartbeat. They were out of the dead zone, but for the doctors back at Seattle General, the real storm was just beginning to head their way. The descent of the Black Hawk onto the hospital roof was far more aggressive than its departure. The pilot, fueled by the same adrenaline-soaked urgency that permeated the cabin, slammed the bird down onto the pad with a force that rattled the windows of the executive offices 3 floors below. Before the skids had settled, the side doors were thrown wide. Nia emerged first. She was no longer the pristine, quiet professional who had been bullied over morning coffee. Her flight suit was a canvas of the mission. Dark smears of Sergeant Thorne's blood across her chest, a streak of carbon from the flare gun on her cheek, and the scent of cordite and high-altitude ozone clinging to her like a second skin. Steele and his team followed, carrying the litter with the precision of a drill team, the rhythm of their boots matching the steady mechanical beep of the portable life support Nia had rigged in flight. They didn't wait for the elevators. They hit the stairwell, a tactical blur moving toward the ER. When the double doors of the trauma bay hissed open, the world inside seemed to stop. Dr. Harrison was standing at the central station, a coffee in one hand and a chart in the other, mid-sentence in a complaint about unprofessional conduct. He froze, the coffee sloshing over the rim of his cup as the woman he had called Clueless strode into the center of his domain. The silence was total. Every nurse, resident, and orderly stood paralyzed. Nia didn't look like a nurse returning from a break. She looked like a conqueror returning from the front. Clear Bay 1. Nia's voice didn't just carry, it commanded. It was a tone that brooked no argument, a frequency of authority that overrode the hospital's hierarchy instantly. Now, Steele echoed, his presence looming behind her like a thunderstorm. Harrison stammered, his face turning a mottled red. Carter? What in the hell do you think? Nia didn't even break her stride. She moved to the monitor, her fingers flying over the interface with a speed Harrison had never witnessed. Patient is Sergeant Elias Thorne. GSW to the chest, shrapnel spray, aortic breach stabilized via field thoracotomy and vascular clamp. He's had 2 liters of whole blood and a manual cardiac massage. I need a surgical team that can handle a graft, and I need them 5 minutes ago. Dr. Miller stepped forward, his eyes wide as he looked at the open, sutured chest of the soldier on the litter. He saw the placement of the clamp, a feat of surgical perfection performed in a vibrating helicopter. He looked at Nia, then at the silver oak leaves on her shoulders, and finally at her face. The clueless nurse was gone. In her place stood a lieutenant colonel of the 160th. I'll prep the ore, Miller whispered, his arrogance completely shattered. Nia watched as the trauma team took over, her eyes never leaving Thorne until he was being wheeled toward the elevators. Only then did she turn back to the central station. Harrison was still standing there, looking small, his lab coat suddenly appearing absurdly white and unearned. Nia walked up to the desk. She didn't shout. She didn't gloat. She simply reached into her vest and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. The intake chart Harrison had yelled at her about 3 hours ago. She laid it on the desk, right next to his spilled coffee. I finished the paperwork, Dr. Harrison, she said, her voice a calm, lethal silk. I also corrected your diagnosis on the patient in Bay 2. It wasn't a laceration. It was a tension pneumothorax. I took the liberty of inserting a chest tube before I left. You might want to sign off on it before the board realizes you almost killed a man while you were busy mocking my hair. She reached up, unclipped her tactical vest, and draped it over the chair Harrison usually used for his teaching moments. You called me clueless, Nia said, leaning in so only he could hear. But while you were learning how to bill insurance, I was learning how to keep the heart of a dying man beating with my bare hands. I think we're done here. She turned and walked toward the locker room, her gait steady and sure. The ER staff watched her go. The legend of Viper 1 already spreading through the halls like wildfire. The slow nurse had left the building, and she wasn't coming back. The locker room was silent, save for the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet and the distant, fading whine of the Black Hawk's turbines. Nia sat on the wooden bench, her head bowed, finally allowing the adrenaline to recede. She scrubbed at a dry patch of blood on her knuckle, her movements slow and deliberate. She was no longer hiding. But the weight of the transition, from the invisible clueless nurse back to the legendary Viper 1, felt heavier than the tactical vest she had just shed. The door creaked open. It wasn't a fellow nurse or a terrified resident. It was the chief of hospital operations and the head of the medical board, flanked by a pale, trembling Dr. Harrison. Colonel Carter, the chief began, his voice thick with a sudden, unearned reverence. We were unaware of your standing with the Department of Defense. DR. Harrison has informed us of the DR. Harrison has informed you that he spent 6 months trying to break me because he couldn't handle a nurse who was smarter than him, Nia interrupted, her voice like a cold blade. She stood up, her flight suit rustling in the quiet room. She didn't look like a subordinate. She looked like a reckoning. The head of the board stepped forward, his hands clasped nervously. We would like to offer our sincerest apologies for the environment you've endured. We are prepared to offer you a senior administrative role, a full clinical directorship, and a salary that reflects your true expertise. We want you to lead our new tactical trauma unit. Nia looked at Harrison. The man couldn't even meet her eyes. He was staring at the floor, the same floor where her ID badge still lay in the hallway, a discarded relic of a life she had outgrown. You're offering me a seat at a table that I've already moved past, Nia said quietly. You didn't see my value when I was wearing scrubs and natural curls. You only see it now because a Black Hawk landed in your driveway. That's not leadership. That's damage control. She turned toward her locker and pulled out a clean, crisp olive drab jacket. On the sleeves were the insignias of her new life. Not just a reactivation, but a promotion. I'm not staying, she continued, zipping the jacket. As of 0600 hours, I've accepted a position as the Director of Combat Medical Integration for Special Ops Command. I'll be training the next generation of flight surgeons. I'm going where calm is respected and where the stakes are actually understood. She walked past them, her shoulder brushing Harrison's as she exited. In the hallway, the ER staff had gathered in an impromptu gauntlet. There were no whispers of Clueless Carter now. As she moved toward the exit, a young black nursing student, who had often been the target of the same surgeon's barbs, stood at attention and gave a small, tearful nod of respect. Nia paused, squeezed the girl's shoulder, and whispered, Don't ever let them dim your light. They're just afraid of what they can't control. At the hospital's glass entrance, Captain Steele was waiting. A second helicopter was already hovering nearby, its rotors humming with the promise of a new mission. Ready to go home, Colonel? Steele asked, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his tactical paint. Nia looked back at the hospital one last time. She saw the sterile gray walls, the flickering lights, and the experts watching her from the windows like ghosts. She felt the wind from the rotors hit her face, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was holding her breath. I'm already there, Captain, she said. She stepped out into the night, the legend of Viper One no longer a secret, but a beacon. The clueless nurse was gone, and the sky was finally open. The story of Nia Carter reminds us that our worth is not defined by the labels others place on us, but by the fire we carry within. If Nia's journey moved you, please like and subscribe for more stories of underestimated heroes. Comment Viper One below if you believe excellence is the best revenge.